On July 4, 1863, General Robert E. Lee and his army began their retreat from Gettysburg to Virginia, minus some 28,000 casualties. That same day, 1,000 miles to the west, the 30,000 Confederate defenders of Vicksburg surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant and his army after a siege of more than 2 months. 5 days later, the Confederate garrison at Port Hudson, Louisiana fell, and the Union controlled the Mississippi River from its headwaters to the Gulf of Mexico. One brief month ago, we were apparently at the point of success, wrote Confederate General Josiah Gorgas. All looked bright. Today, absolute ruin seems to be our portion. Despite this string of defeats, the Confederacy fought on. In September, General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee attacked at Chickamauga Creek, and after 2 days of fighting, drove the Union Army of the Cumberland back to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Roughly 128,000 men were engaged at Chickamauga, and it proved to be the bloodiest battle in the West, with more than 34,600 casualties. Bragg followed the Union Army and took up positions near Chattanooga. Ulysses S. Grant arrived to take command and spent a month assembling forces to break Bragg's siege of the city. In late November, Grant and his 70,000-man army attacked. His troops seized Lookout Mountain, then stormed Missionary Ridge, and drove the 50,000 Confederates from the field. 6 weeks later, Grant was back east. He was now General-in-Chief of all Union armies and determined to defeat Robert E. Lee and his veterans. Grant began his Virginia campaign in early May with more than 115,000 men. Over the next 6 weeks, Grant's Army of the Potomac and Lee's Army of Northern Virginia clashed at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor. The Union casualties were staggering, 55,000 in all, compared to 31,000 for the Confederates. But Grant proved himself unlike any opponent Lee had yet faced. He attacked after every defeat, and next conceived a bold plan to shift his army south across the James River and take Petersburg, Virginia, an important rail center just south of Richmond. Grant's maneuver caught Lee by surprise, but Union commanders in the field were slow to press their advantage. Lee swiftly shifted troops south, and Grant's opportunity to capture Petersburg and perhaps Richmond slipped away. The two exhausted armies now settled into trench warfare along a front that eventually stretched some 40 miles. In the west, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's 100,000 men advanced into Georgia in early May. For 2 months, General Joe Johnston's Army of Tennessee, about 60,000 strong, repeatedly stalled Sherman's advance at Resaca, New Hope Church, Pickett's Mill, Kennesaw Mountain, and then fell back. Finally, in early July, Sherman found a way around Johnston's flank and forced the Confederates to withdraw behind the Chattahoochee River, the last defensive line before Atlanta. In mid-July, Sherman's army reached the outskirts of Atlanta. Confederate President Jefferson Davis replaced Johnston with General John Bell Hood, and Hood promptly attacked Sherman's positions outside the city, but failed to drive off the Union forces. On September 1st, with Sherman's army closing in, the Confederate troops evacuated the city. The next day, Sherman telegraphed Washington, "Atlanta is ours, and fairly won." As Sherman laid siege to Atlanta, Rear Admiral David Farragut led a Union naval force toward one of the Confederacy's last open ports, Mobile, Alabama. Forts, obstructions, and underwater mines guarded the entrance to the harbor. But on August 5th, Farragut's fleet ran the Confederate gauntlet, entered Mobile Bay, and closed the port. Hoping to shift the balance of the war in the east, Lee dispatched 14,000 men under General Jubal Early to the Shenandoah Valley in June. Grant countered with General Philip Sheridan and nearly 40,000 Union troops. In the battles of Winchester and Cedar Creek, Sheridan and his troops drove the Confederates from the valley. The Union victories at Atlanta and the Shenandoah Valley boosted Northern morale and helped Abraham Lincoln win the November 1864 presidential election. After Atlanta fell, Hood led his battered army north and nearly destroyed it in assaults on Union positions near Franklin and Nashville, Tennessee. Sherman headed southeast out of Atlanta on November 14th with 60,000 of his most experienced soldiers. His goal was to end the Confederacy's ability to wage war, so his troops lived off the land and destroyed everything that might aid the war effort. On December 21st, he reached the sea and captured Savannah, Georgia. Then in January, Sherman turned his army north toward Columbia, South Carolina, brushed aside much smaller Confederate forces, and brought the war to the Carolinas. Grant spent the late summer, fall, and winter of 1864 probing the Confederate lines around Petersburg and Richmond, Virginia. Lee managed to repel the Union thrusts, but by March 1865, the Confederate situation was growing desperate. Lee believed his best hope was to move west and unite with the remnants of the Army of Tennessee. He never got the chance. On April 2nd, a general Union assault broke the Confederate lines, and Lee had little choice but to evacuate Petersburg and Richmond. The next day, Union forces marched into the Confederate capital. Lee's army staggered west in hopes of linking up with other units or reaching the security of the Appalachian Mountains. Grant's troops intercepted rations and supplies on their way to Lee's men, and then cut off the Confederates' escape at Appomattox. His army reduced to about 30,000 men, many of them starving. Lee had no choice but to surrender. On April 9th, he met Grant in the village of Appomattox Courthouse and surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. With the news of Lee's surrender, Confederate morale and resistance collapsed. On April 18th, Joe Johnston surrendered the Army of Tennessee to Sherman at Greensboro, North Carolina. This left General Kirby Smith's Army of the Trans-Mississippi as the last Confederate force of importance. On May 26, Smith ordered his men to lay down their arms, and the Civil War was over.